Hello, welcome to another lecture. This is the week when we talk about slavery and race, the making of racism in a society where slavery was still alive and growing. And there were not a whole lot of voices that criticized it. And those that did, if you consider Sojourner Truth, were given a rather hostile treatment. Now, the beauty of the speech, Ain't I a Woman, that Sojourner Truth gives to that audience in the church where the Women's Rights Convention meets, is how she manages to win over this majority hostile, almost exclusively hostile audience. Racist catcalls, sexist catcalls, heckling from the galleries by people who were there for no good reason other than to actually disrupt the proceedings. And yet, this black woman, in the end, has these hecklers in tears, convinced that they were wrong. So what it shows is that, yes, it is possible to shake people out of their racism. It is possible to build awareness that humans are, in fact, equal, that this simple truth, this self-evident truth, to quote Thomas Jefferson, is, in fact, much more valid than any of the highly sophisticated arguments with biblical, historical, and philosophical refinement that the defenders of slavery and the defenders of racism are making. And you see that in one prominent example, in the example of George Fitzhugh. He is one of the most read propagandists for slavery at the time. And yes, he has an impressive range of an intellectual arsenal of intellectual weapons. However, in the end, when it comes down to it, Sojourner Truth's argument that really is, I am human. I suffer like you. I work like you. I have to eat and drink and have housing. I cry over the loss of family members into slavery just like you would. So there is no essential difference between us that has to do with my race or with my gender. Up until recently, I would have said, and this is of course where we are today, and these are the values that we share in America. But of course, nowadays, with the ascendancy of the present regime and the transformation of the Republican Party into an instrument of fascist program and ideology, this is no longer true. So the assumption that all people are equal and deserve equal rights and dignity, regardless of their race and gender, that is not true for this country anymore. It is once more a contested question. Should people be considered equal? Should they be treated equally? And a large minority of Americans who are presently in power and who are loud and violent believe that no, they shouldn't be. They will deny, if you ask them, if you point out to them that in fact what they're doing is to restore white male supremacy, but of course it's an attempt to whitewash, pardon the pun, these political positions. So it's not like the racist argument, the argument against equality hasn't gotten its share of exposure. It hasn't gotten fair play. And so maybe this lecture eventually needs to be revised. Maybe it is now once more required to make the argument for equality. But up until recently, where Sojourner Truth was clearly the hero, and George Fitzhugh and the defenders of slavery, the Confederates who fought to preserve slavery, were clearly the villains. And for that reason, people didn't talk much about the losing side in the Civil War. But even if now the losing side in the Civil War is once again the winning side in American politics, we still need to talk about what the winners in the South, what the people who were in charge in the South, rather, the powers in the South, believed, how their thinking about race shaped our debates to this day. So this is an important part that still justifies giving extensive play to somebody like George Fitzhugh, who says black people are inferior, slavery is the natural and good order. And so I do want to go ahead with a clear disclaimer that this is not an endorsement. To channel his positions is not an endorsement of these positions, of discussing George Fitzhugh. Now, the path to Fitzhugh for a historian goes through Eugene Genovese, who was a Marxist historian in the 1960s, but in his last couple of years became a conservative, a supporter of George W. Bush, largely because he believed that the left had abandoned the working class, had abandoned class and the critique of capitalism altogether. And that if you were upset about the consequences thereof, then you really had nobody left but conservatism to turn to. That's an interesting twist for somebody to take. And by the time he wrote The Mind of the Master Class, this was his position. His mission in his professional life was to convince conservatives that if they take seriously their critique of moral decay, the preservation of the family, the restoration of morality, and so forth, they really needed to be against capitalism, because capitalism was the root of the destruction of all good order in society. And so in this way, Genovese, who studied and criticized George Fitzhugh in his earlier career in the 60s and 70s, becomes a modern day George Fitzhugh, because that is Fitzhugh's argument in the 1850s. Slavery, a racial hierarchy, a gender hierarchy, with white men clearly in charge, that is the antidote against the disruptions caused by capitalism. So there is lots of stuff that's going on here that is worth discussing, but we need to start with understanding the text. And in this case, that means I want to focus on George Fitzhugh, on this defender of slavery. So let's do that. What is the view that Fitzhugh embraces here? The view that the slaveholders have, but that he theorizes, that he makes into a theory, a sociology, as he says in one of his books, Sociology for the South. It's a benevolent institution, slavery is, because Africans are inherently incapable of being free. They are like children. And if you think that analogy through to its logical consequence, they are innocent, but they also need direction. They might occasionally need punishment, but they also need protection. They need to be nursed and fostered. And if you've been paying attention in this class, then this argument is familiar, because John Adams was saying the same thing about white men without property, women, and so forth. They're all like children. So if there are children around, there must be some people who are parents. And in this case, the parent is the white male master. And if he is a good parent, he is concerned with the welfare of his dependents. He brings them up to a level that he can, given the material. Now, unlike children, and this is where the analogy ends, who will eventually grow up and become adults and can do things for themselves, the assumption that Fitzhugh makes and that the slaveholders make is that Africans can never become full adults, they can never become fully free. The most you can expect, as he says, in Virginia, or Negroes have almost reached a level of civilization comparable to white people, but no further than that. Another instance where the slaveholders will say we are doing good for the slaves is that they're employing them in agriculture. Unlike industry, which is about artifice, it's about taking things and removing them many, many steps further from nature. Agriculture is to work with nature. And therefore, humans are in their most healthy environment. If you look at industry in the North, and if you remember the weeks when we discussed the labor unions and the House of Refuge, the sorry state of the working population and its children in the North, yes, industry and the free labor, that is to say the labor for wages performed by free people, is degrading. It harms people, it ruins their health, it ruins their morality. They drink themselves to an early death They break their bodies working hard and not getting enough rest and not getting enough sleep. The family is destroyed, morality is destroyed. It's a mess. So by contrast, and if you don't look too closely, slavery looks good. Based on this idea that the slaveholder is a benevolent patriarch, the historical model is the lord of the manor. The slaveholders see themselves as the knights in shining armor who presided over the peasants of the Middle Ages, with absolute power, but also with a sense of mutual obligation. And if you're thinking about the culture of the South, the refinement, the politeness, then what you have here is an echo of that enthusiasm of the Southern ruling class, of the slavocracy, for the medieval nobility. They fashioned themselves after those knights in shining armor, including the honor code, the strong sense that you are supposed to treat people with respect and politeness and so forth. Of course, in the South, as well as in the Middle Ages, the flip side of that strong sense of honor is a tendency to be easily feeling slighted. And then if somebody doesn't hold up the honor code, you immediately go and duel or resort to violence. So in a way, this is also suitable for upholding the racial order, because nobody is going to be held to a higher standard of knowing their place than the African Americans, free and enslaved in the South. So if somebody looks at a white person askance, to quote the German Emperor William II, white society will come down on him like a ton of bricks. And after the Civil War, this becomes a matter of, the origin of most lynchings, of this extrajudicial violence against Black people who don't know their place. The lynching that starts with somebody feeling slighted because, a Black person looked at a white person in a way that suggested he wasn't giving the full respect and honor that was due. So another analogy, of course, with the medieval manor, with the agricultural estate of the Middle Ages, is that the slaves, like the serfs of old, have to absolutely render service to their lord in the fields. They get fed by the lord, and of course, unlike in the Middle Ages, they don't have to render military service, which should give people pause, because why don't you give slaves weapons? Because deep down that no, it isn't a benevolent institution, they'll use them against you. But really, it's not the slave and not the practice of the slave plantation that makes for the meat of this argument. It's the comparison. The plantation really is just a foil. What mainly the slaveholders and people like Fitzhugh are talking about is the factory. And here they are at their best. And here they can speak truth to power without risking pulling the legitimacy out from under their own way of life. So, and of course, the main competing ruling class in the US are these merchants and manufacturers of the North, who are now increasingly calling the shots economically and politically. And the South, the slaveholders of the South are locking horns with them, fighting over control of the national institutions. So if you can convince the workers of the North that you, the slaveholders, are the people who really pay attention to their plight, you give legitimacy to their complaints. You're saying, yes, we feel your pain. I know you're not getting paid enough. They say you're free, but look at what you can do with your freedom. You can starve to death. Nobody has a sense of obligation to you. Your bosses, once you walk out the door, wash their hands of you. If you can't feed your family, if you're poor and working full-time, none of their problem. How different it is for us, the slaveholders, by comparison. We care about the people who work for us. We won't let them leave. We make sure they have housing and they're fed and so forth. And for many people in the North, the pull of this argument is that, yes, there is now somebody who's actually telling it like it is. The slaveholders are speaking truth to power, to the power of the factory owners and of all these defenders of free market capitalist society in the North. Nobody in the North is going there, only the slaveholders are. So how nice would it be if the North returned to these family-like relations between employer and employee? If, like the master of the craft of old, the factory bosses would feel obliged that their people are healthy and living a dignified life, and yet they don't. So what the slaveholders argue is that what happened in the North is that the natural bonds of dependency between people were cut, whereas on the slave plantation they remain, they have been preserved. They're arguing again with traditional society. They're claiming that what Winthrop liked about traditional society, that people are linked in a big pyramid of connections for everybody's benefit in this natural hierarchy. That is still the case in the South, and that's the problem in the North. The freedom is the problem. People are free to do to each other whatever they please if they have the money and the power to do so. It is just about cold cash that connects people, and nothing, absolutely nothing beyond that. In a way, this claim about the plantation as a last holdout of the good old days and as an alternative to industrial capitalism is a lie. Even before we get to talk about the reality of slavery, that it's not like a family, that it's not benevolent, that the slaves are not exactly taken care of, because if you look closely, yes, they have to eat and they have a roof over their head. But it wasn't exactly the master who provided it. They're given a patch of land where they can grow vegetables for themselves, but only after their work for the master is done. That's the extent of him feeding them. They do get the occasional barrel full of pork byproducts, like the feet and snouts and ears and so forth. The infamous pork barrel that is still around in American language as in the phrase of pork barrel politics. They're given salt and clothing, which they can't make for themselves. And they're giving building materials and a plot to build their slave quarters. But it's actually their own labor in their free time, not during the master's time. So, but you don't even have to go there. You can criticize the view of the slaveholders even without going into the details of the reality of the plantation. First, the medieval manner that is supposed to be the model existed in a society where nobody was free. So to say that the slave plantation is preserving it is a lie, because if there is the possibility of freedom in this society, it's no longer the same thing. You can't go back to before to the point before the fall from grace, so to speak. Secondly, the plantation as it exists in the 19th century is not an alternative to capitalism. It is not an alternative to industry. It is part of a world system where it is linked, joined at the hip, dependent on industry in every way. Because first, remember, in the 18th century, it is the merchants who start the plantation economy, whose money then goes on to fund industry. Whereas in the 19th century, industry has come into its own. It is standing on its own feet, but it still requires the input of agricultural products from the plantation, that is to say, the cotton. So the first wave of industrialization, and in the 1850s, still the biggest single branch of industrial production is textiles. And all that goes into that is cotton made by slaves. So without the factories that Fitzhugh and others deplore publicly and say this is horrible, look at the way people have to work, look at capitalism and what it does to people, they are of course part of it. Their way of life, their plantation wouldn't exist without it. Now, another thing about the medieval manner, about the Middle Ages and the idea of freedom. I said that nobody was free in the Middle Ages. Let me qualify that. There was a notion of freedom, but by definition, the people who were free were the people who didn't do work, and the people who were unfree were the people who did do all the work. The nobility considered themselves to be free, and freedom to them was something that belonged not to everybody. It wasn't an idea that everybody is born equal. It was specific to their social class, to their order. Nobles are free, they get to do what they want, they're better people. If you have to work, then that indicates that you're not a good person. Consider the term villain, somebody who is evil, who is morally depraved, which of course, by way of the French language, comes from village. A villain in French, is somebody who lives in a village. So if you're a peasant, that indicates you're not free, you're a lesser person, and that is because you have to do work. The good people, the noble people, the special people are the ones who don't have to work. And so this view of labor as a source of dishonor and the disdain for people who perform labor carries over from the medieval view into modern times by way of the thinking of the slave owners. People who have to work are probably a lesser sort. And so the moment that the idea settles in that the worst kind of work and the most demeaning kind of work is performed by Africans, which of course through slavery for a while that seems to carry some truth to it, labor becomes racialized. The idea is that people who have to perform menial work, backbreaking, horrible work, are not good people. And they have to do that kind of work because they're not good for anything else. And well, look who's doing all that work. They're all black. So there's probably something wrong with them because they're black, because they're from Africa. So this is the entry point for racism, the contempt for manual labor, which comes out of the Middle Ages, is adapted and attaches itself to contempt for people with black skin. It becomes the content, the first main content of racism, the racialization of labor, the contempt for Africans because they're the ones who are doing all the work nobody else wants to do. So in a way, then, the idea of the slaveholder, that they are medieval lords, that they are the people who take care of the peasants, has a truth to it in a sick and twisted way, in an unintentional way. It reveals the racism, it reveals the disdain that is built into this system, because ultimately the nobility had strong disdain for the peasants. And then over the centuries, up until the revolutions, the history of European societies is full of attempts to get the nobility to show some respect after all, and to treat people decently. But up until the early modern and certainly in the medieval times, there were many telling examples of the attitudes that the nobles took towards the peasants. I don't recall for sure which battle it was during the 100 Years' War in the High Middle Ages, the French fighting the British, but the French side had hired crossbow fighters from Genoa, commoners, who they considered useless because the way they were positioned in this battle against the English, they didn't have the range to reach the English cavalry, let alone the English archers, which were ranged, long range weapons, unlike the crossbows. But in order to get on horseback to the British lines, the French knights on horseback had to get through the spot where the Genoese were sitting. And so rather than wait and tell them to move, they simply slaughtered them because they were expandable. And then they bragged about it in the chronicles when they wrote about it later. these useless peasants, I mean, they were townsfolk, citizens of Genoa, but they were commoners, were just in the way. And so it was a point of honor and sport to butcher your own crossbowmen so that you could get to the British. The 100 Years' War is also telling this chronicle in particular of the battles, in that after the battles, there's a long list of all the nobles who left their lives on the battlefield. And it's equal in treating the British and the French. Everybody is given the same kind of honor. You get a paragraph telling the story, who the weeping widow and the son who vows revenge and whatnot. And then after multiple pages of mourning the loss of these nobles, the honorable people on the battlefield of both sides, you get in afterthought half a sentence, oh, and 10,000 peasants. So for those people who are in charge, disdain for the lower sorts, the smelly people who have to do work, who you really don't want to be in a room with, makes some sort of sense. The contempt makes some sort of sense. But not every racist is rich. Not every racist benefits from privilege. And in fact, so many people who have to do work buy into a notion that at least while they're doing work, they're still more honorable than others because after all, they're white. What's the incentive for, in other words, for white working class racism? Because that doesn't follow directly from what I've just said about the origins of racism among the upper class in the South. Especially since the labor that the white northern working class performs is every bit as demeaning and in many ways less rewarding in terms of your life's chances and opportunities in industry by the time you get to the 1850s as any kind of horrible plantation labor in the South. So how does a white, legally free wage worker from the North nevertheless convince himself that he is nonetheless better than a black person because of his skin color and possibly because of his work? Let's first look at an indicator that this did happen, that the working class of the North at one point moved away from regarding themselves as equal by virtue of performing labor to Africans. Because if you remember Olaudah Equiano on that ship, he was one of the crew. He was the only black person on that boat. He was a slave. And yet his white crew members, his fellow crew members, challenged their superior officer, stepped all the way up to the line where they could have been court-martialed and would have lost their bounty, their hefty payment for their services, to defend Equiano, to make sure he didn't get sold. So in the old order, in the traditional order, labor was something that defined a person's identity. And if you did the same kind of work, you were one of the guys. Equiano was going to become a barber, work alongside as an apprentice, and eventually become a master of the trade with Daniel Queen, his friend and mentor. And for the tradesman in the barber's trade in England, it wouldn't have been odd that he is black, because as a qualified craftsman, he would have had their respect for his skills. So how does that change? Consider that at the time Equiano lived, all people who worked called the person whom they worked for their master. You have the master of the craft, you have the slave master, you have the master of the vessel. Yet today, when you go to work, you're not working for a master, you're working for a boss. This language changed in the late 18th century, just as industrialization was beginning. And it accelerated once it really took off. The moment that the relationship between the craftsmen and their employers changed, the word boss crept into the English language, first in the city of New York. If you look at the etymology of the word boss, you will find that it's a loan word from the Dutch. And of course, New York has a strong Dutch element. It used to be a Dutch colony. It used to be called New Amsterdam. And the Dutch sailors coming to the port of New York, people living there knew their Dutch, and they knew what boss meant, or baas, B-A-A-S, in the Dutch language. Turns out that's the Dutch word that means master. But rather than keep using the English word master, English-speaking New York working class people stopped doing that and used the Dutch loan word boss. So that by the language, they indicate that what they're doing is they're no longer working for a master. That's something that slaves do. So you're getting a sense that the working class in the North begins to buy into this idea that yes, what they're doing is different because they are free, and eventually because they're white. Another path of creating white working class racism against all sense and logic is, of course, the Democratic Party, Andrew Jackson's white man's democracy. I discussed the member of Congress, the one worker who got elected to Congress in the 1850s, clearly somebody who had read George Fitzhugh and was familiar with his argument, and who made it his main goal while in Congress to defend slavery against any and all criticism, rather than work on specific issues of interest to workers in the North: hours, working conditions, wages, unions, public works, public housing, none of them. All it was about race and about slavery. So the Democratic Party is, of course, the organization led by the planters, by the slaveholders of the South. But the bulk of their voters in the North is that white working class. So it's kind of like a crossover situation. The ruling elite of the South mobilizes and organizes the underdog in the North, which is to say the working class. On the other side, the ruling elite in the North, the factory owners, the merchants, the bankers, by embracing abolitionism by the end of the 1850s, by starting to mobilize the slaves against the Southern elite, they're both playing the same game. So that you have the Northern ruling class making common cause with the Southern working class, with the slaves on the plantations, and the Southern ruling class making common cause with the Northern working class. And this is especially true once the genuine organizations of Northern workers were ended. Once the working men's parties came to an end, which were not concerned with race, which were not particularly enthusiastic about slavery, and once the Democratic Party, through Andrew Jackson, comes to define the common man as a white man. So the backbone of the republic is the people who perform the honest work, and that means just the white people. Perhaps then by extension, that means that the black people perform dishonest work or dishonorable work. But that is the political part of this equation is another important source of race as something that working class people in the North find defines them. And of course, again, if you are a member of the working class in the North and you're looking for somebody who articulates your grievances, who takes seriously and cares about your plight and doesn't dismiss it as something that simply happens when you have a free market, and don't we all want freedom? So I guess we also do want unemployment and children who starve from a lack of nutrition in working class families, and children who are forced to steal and engage in prostitution. It is the price of freedom that we must pay. If you don't want to settle for that, and if you're looking for somebody who actually at least rhetorically, if not practically, takes up your cause, there is not much else to go around. Rather, other than the slaveholders and somebody like George Fitzhugh who's saying, yes, isn't it a shame that this is happening to you? And the reason it's happening to you is because the slaveholders are criticized for being racists, when really all they want is a society where everybody is dependent and can depend on their master. Wouldn't it be nice to go back to that? Vote Democrat. So that is the way in which slavery and the ideas that the slaveholders embraced, ably and articulately laid out by George Fitzhugh, who is therefore worth reading, have given us as the legacy that we're still struggling with. There is a lot of surface plausibility in this ultimately big lie of racial difference. And if you're discouraged by the salience of that lie and by the success of it, do revisit Sojourner Truth's brief but powerful message of equality as an antidote. But let's also not neglect to read and understand the other side, the people who defended slavery in the 1850s and who now once more are in power and making decisions in this country. So that concludes the lecture, and I hope that from the group that presents we'll get some ideas about what this means for our notion of freedom, for the oft used and less oft defined word that is so important in American political discourse.